Welcome to my Porch Goose sewing series. I have a bunch of really fun Porch Goose sewing patterns, and my goal is to make them a little bit easier and more fun for you to sew. So I'm going to start a series where we sew through some of my favorite Porch Goose patterns. The one that we're going to be sewing today is called the Daisy Goose dress, and it's a really simple one to get started because it just has two pattern pieces, the top or the yoke and then the skirt pattern. And you can find the patterns on my website at oceancodepatterns.com. If you'd rather buy them from Etsy, you can get them in my sister's shop. Her Etsy shop is called Edie Nut, Edeenut. Okay, so this is the fabric that I've chosen to make the skirt out of. So you'll just place your skirt piece on the fold here. One thing I wanted to mention is when you're working with a fabric that has a directional print, you just want to make sure a directional print is the fabric that's printed so that there's a definite up and down. So obviously the heads and the feet on this print. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're working through your project so that you don't end up with the people upside down on your finished project. So here is the skirt piece, and I'm just going to place it on the fold and only cut around these three edges so that when you open it up, that fold is still intact. So I'm going to go ahead and pin it into place. Okay, so I cut one skirt on the fold. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to sew on the sewing machine is along the top edge of our skirt. We're going to start and finish about 1 inch from each edge, and we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches along the very top edge. Now, a basting stitch is a stitch that we don't log or back stitch at the beginning or the end. We leave long tail threads and we stitch at the longest stitch length possible that our machine allows, and I will show you how to do that on the machine. Okay, so like I said, we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches along the top edge of our skirt. We're going to start and end about 1.5 inches in from each edge. And again, because I'm using directional fabric, I'm going to make sure I'm doing the basting stitches at the top of my fabric. I have, just for this tutorial, and this might help you if you're a beginner to basic gathering and basting stitches, I've got a different colored thread in my bobbin so that it will be easier to distinguish later on, and I'll explain this a little bit more later on. So I'm going to keep long tail threads. I am not going to leave a back stitch at the beginning or the end, and I am going to adjust my stitch length to the longest possible on my sewing machine. The first row of stitches I'm doing here is a 1/2 inch from the edge of my fabric. The next row of basting stitches I'm going to make is going to be 1/8 of an inch away from the first row of stitching that I already made. If you're just starting out and this is your very first gather with basting stitches, I might recommend stitching 1/4 of an inch or even 3/8 of an inch away from your first row of stitches, because that will give you a wider or broader space to make our final stitch in the next couple of steps, and I will explain that a little bit later on. But for this tutorial, I'm going to just use about 1/4 of an inch away from my first row of stitching. Again, don't backstitch and leave tail threads. So here we are with our skirt piece. So the next thing I'm going to do is find the center of my skirt and mark. I'm just going to put a pin in to mark the center. And then I'm going to take the yoke piece that I want. I'm going to take the yoke piece that I want shown on the front. There's 2 yoke pieces on this dress. One will be the one that you see when the goose is wearing the dress, The other one is going to be on the inside. So whichever one you want to show on the outside of your goose dress is what we're going to fold over, find the center, and mark the center. Again, I'm just going to stick a pin in there to mark the center. And then what we're going to do is we are going to gather the skirt to fit the under circle of the yoke. So what we're going to do is place the yoke right sides together on top of the skirt piece. I'm going to match centers and pin them both together. And then I'll start from one end and then work on the other and gather the top of the skirt to fit the length of the bottom curve of the yoke. So what you'll do is you'll grab hold of the long tail threads that you left on the bobbin, and I teach my sewing students that this is kind of like pulling a curtain along a curtain rod, and this is our curtain rod and this is our drape, and we're just going to hold on to the curtain rod and slide the fabric along the curtain rod. And what we're trying to do is make even gathers, as even as possible, across the top and fit now this smaller length in onto this length. So I'm going to go ahead and this side of the yoke is going to match up with this side of the skirt. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. Got my bobbin threads. I'm going to continue to pull and gather and evenly distribute these throughout that space. And then pin the top of my skirt along that bottom curve of the yoke. I need to pull more gathers. I want this part to be flat with no gathers, so I'm going to go ahead and pin that. I'm going to remove some of these pins because I need to slide more gathers into this space. That might just about fit. So this is half of the skirt gathered and pinned into half of the yoke. And now I'm going to work on the second part of the skirt, pulling the bobbin threads carefully. Remember, it's kind of like pulling a curtain across the rod. And then I'm going to take the edge of the skirt and pin it to the edge of the yoke. And then continue to pull the bobbin threads into this space to fit evenly. Remember that about a 1.5 inch edge that we didn't do any gather stitches. I want that to lay flat, so I'm going to pin that, keeping those two flat together, and then just gather in between. Anytime you need to tighten up this space, just pull on the bobbin threads, and just fit that into the space. I like to use a lot of pins. I love pins. I know there's pin clip debate, but I love my pins. I feel like they keep everything nice and tight and right in place, and they don't flop around as much as clips do. So I'm just going to give my bobbin threads one more just kind of like tight pull through here on both sides. Just a little, just slightly, just kind of tightens everything up through here. And now let me show you what I've got. Here's the yoke. Now on the yoke piece, we don't want any gathers and we don't want any puckers. We want the yoke to lay as flat as possible. And it's just the skirt that we want gathered up all crazy like this to fit onto the yoke piece. So the next step we're going to do is stitch with a regular stitch, where we're going to back stitch at the beginning and the end, unlike the basting stitch we just did. And what we're going to do is we're going to start stitching from edge to edge, and we're going to stitch right in between those two rows of stitching, and I'll show you more at the machine. Okay, so here we are at the machine. I'm going to adjust my stitch length back to a regular stitch length, and like I said before, we're going to be stitching in between these two rows of basting stitches that we made before. Now this is the part I talked earlier about. If you are a beginner, it's nice to have these two row of basting stitches farther apart because it gives you more of a space in between the stitches to eyeball and get your finished stitch down the middle. If you've done this a lot, obviously, you know, 1/8 of an inch is going to be enough for you to work with. So the next thing we're going to do is gently remove these basting stitches. To remove the basting stitches, just continue to pull them gently. And pull, now what we're doing is pulling them all the way through. All the way through and all the way out of our project. And then the thread, spool thread stitches will come out easily too. Those will just pull and rip right out afterward, after you get the bobbins out. Okay, so now this is what we have. We have the skirt neatly gathered and fit onto the yoke at that bottom curve. The next thing we're going to do for the daisy dress is we're going to take the second yoke piece and we're going to place it right sides on top of the first yoke piece that is now attached to the skirt, and we're going to pin it together because what we're going to do is sew the side and top curve of the yoke to the yoke. Remember, we're pointing all of our seams from the skirt toward the top. So as I pin the second yoke in place, I'm just going to keep that in mind, and I'm going to go ahead and pin that seam allowance facing up. And again over here, push the seam allowance up towards the top as I pin that in place. And then at the sewing machine, we're going to start just at the bottom edge of the yoke, stitch all the way to the corner, pivot, stitch around the curve, pivot and stitch back down just to the end of the yoke on this side. Our seam allowance is 1/2 inch for the Daisy Goose dress. When you pivot at the corner, it's nice to keep the pin down in the fabric as you pivot so that it keeps your stitch in the right place. Again, I'm going to stop with my needle down as I pivot to come back to the other side. Okay, so now we have both of the yolks stitched together, and what we're going to do is we're just going to clip the curves a little bit along the top curve, and we're going to clip these corners. Be careful not to cut into your stitching. We clip the curves so that when we turn it right side out, that curve will have a nice shape. The next thing we're going to do is turn the yoke right side out. And you can use a little turning tool or a blunt point to shape those corners. And then we'll take it to the iron and press along the top edge so that the yoke lays flat and we can press in that nice curve and corners. After we have ironed the yoke and pressed a nice curve and corners for the yoke, and we have pressed the sides to match the seams here, we're going to go ahead and press 1/2 inch along the bottom edge. I already did that and then realized I wasn't recording. So that's why you already see a neatly pressed bottom edge. The next thing we're going to do at the sewing machine is we're going to start at the top of one side of the yoke. We're going to sew down the side, across the bottom, all along the bottom edge of the dress, and then back up and finish our stitching right here. I'm going to stitch about 1/4 inch away from the edge. With the needle down in the fabric, I'm going to pick up my fabric, pivot around to the bottom hem, and continue. you also want to sew along the top edge of the neck, you can. If you want more of a top stitched finished look. I don't know why I've never done it. I think for me and the daisy dress, I just like the folded edge and nicely pressed, but obviously you could stitch along the top edge here if you want. You could even top stitch along your ruffles right here if you wanted on the yoke, just right above the ruffles, and that might give it like an extra little stitching detail. So that's up to you. So the very last step of the daisy dress is just to fasten it in the back somehow. You could add Velcro, you could add snaps. On this particular dress on the Goose, I added snaps. I have a little snap press and different colored snaps. I get them from Cam Snaps, K-A-M. I really like Cam Snaps and their presses. So I always use snaps, but you can use Velcro. You could even add a tie here and just tie it. You could tie it in the front, you could tie it in the back. Use the pattern as a cape. You could put a tie right here. You add trim, you could add buttons, you could add pockets, you could add a ruffle on the bottom. I don't know what else. It's just fun to take a basic pattern and then add to it. But that is the basic Daisy Goose dress, and then in another video I will teach you how to make the bonnet that comes with the pattern. And again, you can find my sewing patterns at oceancodepatterns.com. They're digital downloads, so you'll print them, assemble the patterns, cut them from the paper, and then cut them from the fabric. Also, you can find my sewing patterns at Etsy in my sister shop at Edeenut, and that's spelled E-D-E-E-N-U-T. So, happy sewing, and I'll see you for the next Ocean Code Pattern Porch Goose sewing series.